Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and thank you for joining us for the Naval War College Foundation's third Newport Lecture Series presentation of the 2021 to 2022 academic year, Arms Control for the Third Nuclear Age Between Disarmament and Armageddon. I am George Lang, CEO of the Naval War College Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you this evening. I also wish to thank Chairman Bilden, our esteemed Board of Trustees, members, friends, and benefactors, as well as my staff, for their continued support and commitment for the rewarding missions of the U.S. Naval War College and Naval War College Foundation. Enabled by our generous foundation members and many of you, the college has continued its innovative, cutting-edge research, scholarship, and wargaming programs that have sustained it as America's premier institution and standard bearer for professional military education for our joint and combined multinational force military and civilian teams. Naval War College Foundation is proud to support the U.S. Naval War College in its mission to deliver excellence in education, research, and outreach, and remains committed to providing the critical resources needed to advance its priorities of research and scholarship, curriculum and instruction, endowments and endowed font chairs, capital improvements, faculty and student academic achievement awards, conferences and symposia, and regional studies. Tonight's presentation is a look behind the curtain at the scholarly work U.S. Naval War College students are immersed in during their 10-month rigorous academic program at the college, whose mission it is to educate and develop future leaders of our nation and the world. As a matter of protocol, should you have a question come to you during the presentation, please submit it via the Q&A box, and I'll be happy to present it to our guest speaker during the Q&A session. We plan to address as many of your questions as time permits. As many of you know, pre-COVID, these presentations were typically hosted monthly during the academic year at the Naval Station Officers Club, usually preceded by a 30-minute reception where guests can mingle with the Naval War College Foundation staff, friends, and typically the guest speaker of the evening. However, since the spring of 2020, as many of you know, we've been bringing Newport Lecture Series presentations and many others hosted by the Foundation to you virtually, including the C Award presentation last week in honor of actor and philanthropist Gary Sinise. An added benefit of operating in this virtual environment, of course, is the opportunity it presents to interact with and in some cases reconnect with many of our members and friends from across the country and around the world. We anticipate these lectures will continue virtually for the foreseeable future, but look forward to coming together again in person when it is most appropriate. Now to introduce and welcome your distinguished guest speaker for tonight's presentation, Dr. David Cooper is a professor in the National Security Affairs Department in the Naval War College and holds a tenured faculty appointment as the James B. Forrestal Professor of National Security Affairs. He previously served as the chair of the Department of National Security Affairs from 2010 to 2018. He teaches in the college's core and elective programs. His areas of expertise include non-proliferation, arms control and disarmament, weapons of mass destruction, multilateral negotiations and organizations, international relations theory, and U.S. foreign policy. A scholar practitioner who served for almost 2 decades in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where he held a career appointment in the senior executive service, including at the 2-star level. Dr. Cooper earned a Bachelor of Arts degree from Oberlin College, a Master of International Affairs from the School of International and Public Affairs, Columbia University, and his doctorate from the Australian National University in Political Science and International Relations. Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, please give a warm virtual welcome to Dr. David Cooper.
Thanks very much, George, for that introduction. And let me add my thanks to the foundation and to all of those here who support the foundation, not only for enabling so much of what we do at the college, but in this case, it's particularly appropriate because you've invited me to give a book talk on a new book where I, in fact, wouldn't have been able to do some of that research without support from the foundation. So really do appreciate that. And just on behalf of the entire faculty and indeed the students, let your members know how important the support that we get from you is. So let me kind of go through, let me share the screen here. So I'm going to give a book talk. This is a book that just came out last month from Georgetown University Press. It's caused a little bit of controversy so far, which for an academic is actually a good thing. Normally in life, you don't like people saying mean things about things you've worked on, but in academia, that means they're talking about it, and that is a good thing. I will try to keep my remarks to a half hour or less. We'll see how I do. I suffer from the professorial proclivity to continue blathering on sometimes, but let me try to curtail that proclivity to allow more time for your questions and to have this be more of a dialogue. I will not try to summarize the book, but let me just quickly go through to give you an idea of what the book's about, and then I'll jump in and just try to highlight some key themes and points to hopefully generate a conversation. So the book starts by looking at the nuclear landscape out over the next 10 or 20 years. And basically makes the case that we are moving into a third nuclear age, and I'll talk about that in a little bit in some more detail. Then I go back in the second chapter and I go back and review Cold War theorizing about the idea of adversarial arms control, meaning arms control cooperation between adversaries, and recalling that concept and how it influenced thinking during the Cold War. Then I look at the Cold War negotiating experience in some detail, not really as a history, but in order to glean lessons from that negotiating history that might be useful for today's very different emerging nuclear landscape. Then in the fourth chapter, I lay out what I posit is in fact a new era of nuclear arms racing that we are at the cusp of, and that we are transitioning from the post-Cold War era of denuclearization to a new era of great power nuclear competition, but this time not between two powers, but between three major nuclear powers and several others in the mix. And then in the last chapter, I try to address what is to be done and how can we adapt arms control for these new times. I will warn you that this is not going to be a cheery or optimistic talk, and my conclusions are somewhat pessimistic, but nonetheless, I think very much realistic. So let me take this down for a moment. So what do I mean by third nuclear age? The post-Cold War era has been described as the second nuclear age. And that was a shift from the paradigm of the Cold War, the first nuclear age, where the paradigm was stable bipolar deterrence. That was the guiding paradigm of the Cold War's first nuclear age. The post-Cold War paradigm shifted to what I refer to as a denuclearization framework, where basically there was no further concern about Russia as a major nuclear rival. And so the United States enjoyed conventional dominance over everyone. So the concern shifted really to regional adversaries, such as North Korea or Iran, who might try to get nuclear weapons to offset the American conventional strategic advantage. And really, the reason I call it a denuclearization paradigm is the avowed policy of the United States, bipartisan, Republicans and Democrats, over the course of the Cold War, was essentially to reduce the salience of nuclear weapons, and to do that by sort of a robust non-proliferation effort to prevent countries like Iran or North Korea or Iraq or Syria or Libya from joining the nuclear club, but then also a disarmament effort and reducing incrementally the legacy Cold War arsenals, which in fact were reduced dramatically And that denuclearization paradigm really reached its pinnacle in the 2007 to 2010 period, when the United States formally embraced the idea of global nuclear zero, a world without nuclear weapons. And again, that had critics, certainly on the right, but it was very bipartisan. That was President Obama, but in the campaign against Senator McCain also supported that goal. And some of the prominent supporters of that goal included people like Henry Kissinger. So, I mean, that really was a very dramatic shift from the Cold War. That's all over now. That essentially ended in 2014 with Russia's intervention in Ukraine. And we have been shifting in slow motion since then into, again, a third nuclear age. This third nuclear age is basically an age where you have a tripolar competition between the US, Russia, and China, each of which are competing against each other. And despite the warming relations between Russia and China, they still are in a nuclear dyad where they are targeting and deterring each other. So my central argument in the book is that we as a nation are conceptually, politically, and operationally unprepared for this transition. Borrowing a metaphor by another scholar, Stephen Simbala, I note that this is sort of equivalent to the idea of, if you imagine, villagers who've lived under a dormant volcano for so long that they kind of forget it's a volcano and then wake up and it's rumbling back to life. We're sort of those villagers now, and the volcano of the threat of nuclear disaster is rumbling back to life. But it's been so long since we've thought about these issues that the expertise really isn't there. George mentioned that I am a former practitioner. I'm 56 years old, and in many conferences and whatnot that I go to, I am the youngest person in the room. That is not healthy when a guy who's in his late 50s is the kid in the room. So this expertise is sort of left over from the Cold War, and my argument is we need to grapple with and get a new generation of strategic thinkers thinking about these things. A few years ago, I did a lecture for the college for the Spouses Lecture Series called "A New Arms Race?" ? Well, I think we can drop the question mark at this point, is my argument. But again, this doesn't mean we're just going back to the future. This is not a situation where we can simply dust off the playbook from the Cold War, because this is a very different nuclear landscape that we are heading into. It is sobering to think that everything we think we know about nuclear weapons, deterrence, dissuasion, assurance, warfighting doctrine, all of these things date from living memory. And all of them date from two especially quiet and relatively stable periods of international relations: the bipolar stalemate of the Cold War, and then the unipolar Pax Americana situation of the post-Cold War world. So we are really entering uncharted waters here when we think about trying to understand how deterrence, arms control, all of these sorts of things will work in this sort of tripolar, multipolar environment. Let me pull up one slide to kind of try to visualize this a little bit. So this is what the current nuclear landscape looks like. And if you follow this, what you see is there's what many scholars and strategists have called the big triangle of the United States, China, and Russia. And again, each of those countries is targeting both of the others. But then there's also more in the equation, because Russia has to take into account that Britain and France are also targeting it, and China needs to take into account that India is also targeting it, and then India has to take into account that Pakistan is also targeting it. This can really scramble our understanding of deterrence theory. If you think about it, all of our deterrence theory that we think we know is based on a bipolar construct. The great strategist, British nuclear strategist Lawrence Freedman, talks about nuclear deterrence, and he uses the metaphor of an old Western standoff. You know, that's the picture right there. The two gunfighters, each with their hands, you know, ready to go, but who are deterred because of the risk that the other will outdraw them. This situation that we're in now isn't like Friedman's Old West metaphor of a standoff, but it is an Old West metaphor. The Old West metaphor in this case, though, is more like a Mexican standoff, you know, where a bunch of different people from different gangs are all looking at each other and going like this. From a deterrence stability point of view, that is extraordinarily worrisome. Why is it worrisome? It's worrisome because certainly for the big three, anything that is done by one in response to the other is going to actually trigger a ripple effect. So in other words, for example, Russia basically decided it needed INF range missile systems, in part because China was developing them, and China was developing them and has a shared border, and those systems could target Russia, and Russia didn't have any similar systems. That was sort of intolerable to Russia. How do we know that China was part of the equation? Because President Putin told us this. Starting in 2007, Putin said that Russia would not be able to stay in the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, unless it was expanded to include other countries who had these systems. And although he did not use the word China, he meant China. But now Russia has started cheating on INF. That caused the United States to withdraw from INF. And this then is causing China to be very concerned about the United States, which is causing India to be very concerned about China, et cetera, et cetera. And so it goes. This is a very new situation and very much uncharted waters. And again, very worrisome uncharted waters. But it could get worse. I argue that if this turns into a full-fledged, uncontrolled arms race between these three primary competitors, within the others here, particularly India, arms racing to at least not be left too far behind, that the situation could get worse because there are any number of countries that could get nuclear weapons that have not, because they relied on non-proliferation and US extended deterrence guarantees, who might be freaked out enough by this sort of situation to decide they need their own nuclear weapons. And indeed, we currently see the once unimaginable spectacle of quiet conversations happening within strategic circles in places like Australia, Japan, South Korea, Germany, Turkey, about whether they will need to actually go nuclear. That would have been unimaginable a decade ago. It hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but it is very much happening. So I want you to imagine this current situation, and here I'm not even including the more improbable ones like Germany. I'm including only the most plausible new nuclear powers who might enter this equation and kind of get into this multipolar nuclear fray. And that is going to make this situation look a lot different. And so here, it's really almost now a spider web and a trans-regional spider web. You can imagine here that China does something that worries the Russians. The Russians therefore do something that worries the Turks, and now suddenly it's spilled into the Middle East, and so it goes. So all of these things, I would argue, make this a very unpredictable and dangerous emerging situation that, again, completely scrambles what we think we understand about strategic stability. So in sum, everything we think we know about deterrence is based on experiences in a geostrategic, geopolitical landscape that no longer applies. And we do not understand what a multipolar nuclear order would look like. We're going to be inventing that as we move forward. So nuclear arms racing, in my view, is back with a vengeance. But it's more worrisome than the last nuclear arms race. First, for the reasons I've just discussed, that it's going to be a much more potentially unstable, multipolar and asymmetric multipolar nuclear order, where the arms racing will have many knock-on effects and many ripple effects. But the other reason is that this is already an uncontrolled technology race. The Cold War was both a technology race and a numbers race. This is less of a numbers race, but it is very much a technology race. And the technologies that we see looming on the horizon are every bit as destabilizing, I would argue more so, as what we were facing in the Cold War with the transition to ballistic missiles, to MIRVs, the potential for missile defense. So today we have all sorts of emerging technologies. The headlines have been grabbed by President Putin and his exotic new doomsday weapons, things like the Poseidon, otherwise known as the Apocalypse Tsunami Torpedo. This is almost unimaginable because it really is right out of Dr. Strangelove. This is an actual doomsday weapon. These things are being advertised that they are going to deploy with 100 megaton warheads. So the largest warhead ever tested was the Soviet Tsar-Bomba, which was tested at 50 megatons, although designed for 100. So the 100 claim is not implausible. And the idea of these things is they're going to be autonomous nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed torpedoes launched from subs, which will create huge radioactive tsunamis that will essentially engulf the coasts of enemies of the United States. And these are real. I mean, the new submarine classes are in production. So, I mean, this is something that, again, from a deterrence perspective, Putin is clearly doing this to overcome his concerns and his belief that the U.S. is developing missile defenses that would threaten their deterrent, and he's taking these actions. But beyond that, you have an out-and-out race between all three countries, and in fact, even France and India are involved for maneuverable hypersonic missiles. You've probably heard a lot about these. These are going to be used at all levels of warfare, including as conventional delivery systems. But Russia is already announced that they will be doing these as strategic delivery systems. That is going to completely give a first strike advantage of the sort that, again, we've really never seen, and cut down on warning and essentially eviscerate the possibility, at least with current architecture, of missile defenses. Remerving is happening in Russia. It's happening. China is getting its first MIRVed forces. China is developing mobile MIRVed ICBMs. They are getting a full triad for the first time. And as we know from the headlines, there is now concern that there may be indications that China is poised, having achieved its technological breakthroughs, to have a fully modern triad that they may be poised on numbers to be making a sprint for strategic parity. Some have even suggested strategic superiority. Other technologies are out there. There's worry over the coming decades about ASW and the idea of transparent oceans, which could completely disadvantage the United States, which relies overwhelmingly on the invulnerability of our submarine-based SLBM force. And then there are cognate technologies, cyber, AI, space warfare, and all of these have key nuclear dimensions: cyber, nuclear command and control, AI, nuclear command and control, and space warfare, of course, nuclear command and control. All of these are, again, very worrisome from a deterrence stability perspective. So the existing control architecture is completely unable to put guardrails on any of these trends, in my view, and it's not surprising. It was designed for a benign post-Cold War environment, not to tame the animal spirits of a great power nuclear arms race. So my argument is that we need new guardrails and that we need them fast. This whole thing is gaining momentum. As a matter of fact, writing the book, when I started writing the book, the idea that there was a arms race gaining momentum was controversial. By the time the ink was dry, it's already become cliche. And the rub is that we're not going to get guardrails fast. And this is the pessimistic part. Domestic and international political conditions are not favorable to negotiating new trilateral or plurilateral arms control measures. To the contrary, domestically, we do not have a durable bipartisan consensus on nuclear policy. On the left, we have doves who think that the answer is not stabilizing deterrence. They think the answer is disarmament. The problem, in my view, is that the only disarmament we have on offer is unilateral. Meanwhile, on the right, you have hawks who, having shaken off these treaties, want to try to achieve some form of strategic advantage. I'm all for that in theory. The problem is that in today's budgetary environment and without that bipartisan consensus, we, the United States, in my view, are going to be lucky to not fall too far behind. So my argument from a domestic political point of view is that we really need to coalesce around something that can get bipartisan support. And deterrence-centric arms control, I think, is as good a candidate for that as anything. On the international front, the problem is we have no negotiating leverage. Russia has a significant current advantage in overall nuclear forces. And as I've mentioned, China is now on the hunt to catch up. Neither of them have an incentive to negotiate at this point. So I'm arguing that the only really thing left to do is to try to revive some version of old-fashioned arms control, the goal of which is not to eliminate nuclear weapons, but rather to manage strategic competition and to try to stabilize deterrence relationships. I do believe that that may be achievable, although probably only in the long run. So what would this entail? And I promise I note I'm almost at that 30 minutes. I'm going to finish this up quickly. But what would this entail? First and foremost, it necessitates getting China to belly up to the arms control bar. And China has no motive to do that right now. In the book, I delve into the possible structures and processes that we might want to employ for a trilateral or plurilateral arms control process. I won't get into that now, but I also talk about negotiating dynamics and leverage. And leverage, I think, is a key here. So let me just offer 5 guiding principles from the Cold War experience that I think can guide us as we try to grapple with and come up with how to reinvent a new form of arms control, drawing on the lessons of the Cold War past, which is the last time and the only time that we've ever had any experience trying to control an uncontrolled nuclear arms race with dangerous action-reaction dynamics and dangerous deterrence instability. So 5 principles. The first principle, and the most controversial, certainly in terms of people who've been critics of the book, is we need to return to the idea of arms racing to arms control, what was called the dual track approach. In other words, we're not trying to achieve superiority, but we're basically saying anyone who pulls ahead of us, we are going to match you and we are going to catch up and we're going to keep doing that. So you're not going to get ahead of us, all while offering negotiated alternative solutions. We could keep doing this forever, or maybe we can negotiate something. That is a tremendously powerful way of getting leverage. Now, again, also controversial, as some of my friends who have criticized the book have said, that's just kind of a right-wing hawkish excuse to arms race in sort of arms control sheep clothing, and that often arms racing is just arms racing. So that's an area where I have many people who would disagree with me, but I do believe that unless we are willing to show that we are serious over a period of years and over changes between Republican and Democratic administrations, that we are willing to arms race towards arms control, I don't think we will get China and Russia to show any serious interest. 2, control emerging technology early. And so in this case, that in particular means hypersonics. The Cold War experience shows that once something is deployed, or even in late stages of production, it is very hard to control it, versus if you control it at an initial stage, then it becomes more amenable to control. 3, tailor your controls to what can be verified. The Chinese are absolutely allergic to intrusive verification, just like the Soviets were, really until Gorbachev broke that logjam. And so if we are going to have arms control, it's going to not just be a slow, painful process, but initially it's going to look much more like the SALT 1 process than the START process, where we're controlling big things like missile silos or submarine tubes that can be more easily verified. Pursue small incremental steps. And again, the golden age of arms control sort of was the late 80s, where we got the INF Treaty, we got the START Treaty, we got a bunch of non-nuclear treaties, CFE, CWC, etc. But all of that took slow steps, starting with the hotline agreements in the mid 60s, going to the partial test ban agreement, START 1, moving to START 2, etc. And 5, last but not least, we should, despite the implausibility of all this, not be shy about laying out plausible public proposals, even knowing that they will be rejected. Every successful arms control treaty has started with a proposal that was rejected out of hand. Doing this puts the heat on the Russians and particularly the Chinese to respond to these proposals and explain, why are you rejecting them? What's wrong with them? What proposals would you suggest in return? And in the book, I lay out a series of proposals along those lines. So with that, I see that we are at about 6:34. Let me, again, control that professorial impulse to just keep blathering on and turn it over to George to select some questions and hopefully spend 25 minutes or so in more of a dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper, for your insightful remarks and commentary. I find it fascinating, and congratulations again on your book. Just one I think point, and please correct me if I'm wrong. I know you referenced MERV a couple of times, so for those that might not be that savvy with the abbreviation, so it's multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles, or MERV, so exoatmospheric kind of ballistic missile. If I got that correct.
That is correct, and I should have explained that, because MERVs are very important from a strategic stability calculation, because what that means is essentially one missile can launch 10 warheads that can go to 10 different places. So that, again, is very worrisome. That's a counterforce system that gives a significant first strike advantage. The problem with someone having a first strike advantage is it means that the people on the receiving end of that have a use it or lose it imperative. And this is what led in the Cold War to hair trigger alert postures and launch under attack or even launch on warning by some countries. So moving in that direction, where we are moving again, is important. I should also say there is no term for it yet that has an acronym, amazingly, but there's also the new concept, hypersonic vehicles, hypersonic reentry vehicles of multi-hypersonics, because essentially, and that is what Russia is moving for. The new Sarmat Satan II missile will be the heaviest ICBM in history. So Russian state television is very proud of declaring that it will carry enough MIRVed high-yield warheads to completely obliterate the entire state of Texas or the entire country of France. That's one missile capable of completely obliterating the entire state of Texas. The plan is then to move and deploy those with multiple hypersonic reentry vehicles. The good news is hypersonic reentry vehicles are bigger, so it will be able to carry fewer. The bad news is they are a lot more dangerous because you don't know where they're going to hit until they hit, because they're maneuverable. Anyway, sorry.
Well, you were right about saying it's going to be a pessimistic view rather than an optimistic view.
Well, I teach an elective on this stuff, and my students this year named me Dr. Doom. So
it's wicked, and you're right. Technology is the name of the game here too. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to open the floor for questions. As mentioned, if you submit questions via the Q&A box, and I'll try to get to as many of them as possible. I see we already have some in the queue, so let me just go to the first one from Craig Allen. David, if there's time, could you provide a current status report on the Proliferation Security Initiative?
Hey, Craig, good to hear from you. Briefly, it's still there. It's still doing some very good work. But it is, it is not what it used to be. It sort of was born as a very high level presidential initiative that in some ways was a centerpiece of the non-proliferation efforts of the United States and its closest allies. I think it's now more of a workaday coordination mechanism. So it's still meeting, but it no longer has political oomph. But that is not to say that it's not doing important things, because it may no longer have political oomph, but it does, I think, still provide a really valuable mechanism to kind of coordinate a coalition of the willing to help interdict proliferation-related material in transit. That said, and having spent a great deal of effort in my prior life on that and other non-proliferation efforts, I don't think proliferation is getting better. As a matter of fact, I think all this is going to make proliferation worse. I think there are going to be more countries that decide that no, in this envenomed nuclear landscape, really they need nuclear weapons themselves. That said, I think that proliferation is going to revert, as it was to the Cold War, as a serious but secondary priority of nuclear policy. I think this managing the tripolar deterrence relationship is going to have to take center stage, just because, again, and I don't want to be glib about this, but North Korea and Iran, if they got nuclear weapons, countries of that ilk could certainly cause incredible economic chaos, not to mention, kill potentially millions of Americans. But it's that great power nuclear rivalry which threatens civilizational extinction, and where we've been focusing on non-proliferation. That's been our priority. To the extent that we have nuclear expertise, to the extent that we've been chasing the nuclear problem, it's been trying to deal with the likes of North Korea and Iran. My message is we got to still keep doing that, but we've got literally bigger fish to fry, and that's where we have not had our eye on the prize. We have let this sneak up on us, and we do not have the expertise. We don't have the public or even congressional awareness and knowledge. So I think that's partly why I wrote this book, is to basically say the first step, and I'm not sure this is not going to be an easily solved problem, but it's kind of that 12-step program. The first step to dealing with a sobering problem is admitting you have a sobering problem, and I don't even think we've crossed that threshold as a nation yet.
Wow. From Dennis Mansager, is China's recent test of a hypersonic missile a Sputnik moment for the USA?
Well, I'll reveal my bias here and say I hope so. And by the way, I had a little written disclaimer at the top, but since I'm getting into more controversial things, let me just repeat, these are my own views, not the views of the college or the Navy or indeed anyone else. I think we need a Sputnik moment. Now, the missile gap, et cetera. I mean, the historical record shows that we overreacted to some stuff in the Cold War. But at this point, my assessment is that we are largely underreacting to all this. So, I think we kind of need a Sputnik moment if that's what got the attention of wider strategic circles. I mean, the problem is the nuclear policy community has been fairly isolated from wider strategic thinking. I mean, think about it. We do a national security strategy, a national defense strategy, and then we do a separate nuclear posture review, almost as if that's a whole other thing. One of the things that I argue is that nuclear strategy needs to be incorporated into wider strategic thinking. And then coming down to what I'm talking about, that arms control needs to be reincorporated into nuclear strategy. In the Cold War, arms controllers thought strategically, and strategists thought about the role arms control played in stabilizing deterrence. I think we need to get back to that. In the Cold War, we had many congressional, particularly in the Senate, members who made themselves experts on these. We really don't have that anymore. And in the Cold War, the public, for better or for worse, this stuff was on their minds. Nuclear weapons and the threat of nuclear Armageddon scared the heck out of the general public. The general public thinks of nuclear weapons as a Cold War thing. I have undergraduate students that I teach that when I tell them there are still, right now as we speak, there are still officers down in silos and down in submarines ready to launch world-destroying weapons on a moment's notice. They don't believe me. They get on their computers because they think I'm pulling their leg, and then they're like, "Oh, wow, he's not making that up." It is overwhelmingly difficult to overstate the complacency of the American public about these issues, because they just seem, this was a bullet we ducked during the Cold War. And everyone's worried about cyber now. Everyone's worried about AI. And those things are worrisome. But my argument is one of the most worrisome things about them is their interconnection with nuclear instability. That's not the only thing worrisome about them. I mean, there's lots of things worrisome about them, but that's a really worrisome part of it. So I just think, again, I'll get off my soapbox here. I don't know if this is going to be a Sputnik moment, but I hope it is, because I think we need a Sputnik moment on this stuff.
No, I can relate to everything you're saying. I mean, as a, going through weapons officer school for my, Arleigh Burke, brand new Arleigh Burke destroyer back in 92, I guess. Going through a lot of those weapons, nuclear weapons training courses. They curbed them, set them aside, so no longer necessary. It's pretty wild stuff.
So by the way, George, I'll interrupt you and say one of the obstacles in all this is the Navy. And the Navy is not going to want to go back to that for a lot of good operational reasons. I mean, having nuclear weapons deployed, sub-strategic nuclear weapons, it creates all sorts of headaches. But frankly, it's at the sub-strategic level that Russia and China are eating our lunch. Russia more on tactical, China more on medium and intermediate. And right now, the Navy is the answer to that. I wrote a piece recently arguing the arms control and non-proliferation case for the new nuclear SLCM, which, again, you may agree or not agree with me with that, but I know the Navy is going to fight that tooth and nail. Again, a reminder, these are all my views and not the official views of the Naval War College.
Now, well, thank you for your frank reporting and obviously research and deep analysis. So the next question is from Victor Sussman. Any parallels from the first nuclear age that might pre-stage a transition from pessimism to optimism for arms limitation in the third nuclear age?
Yeah, I mean, I am optimistic in the long run if we can get our act together domestically. If we can get our act together in sort of getting our allies on the same page and reassuring them about extended deterrence. That's part of my argument for the new nuclear SLCM. I think over the long run that Russia will not have the economic wherewithal to pursue an open-ended and uncontrolled arms race against us, and will have incentives to negotiate. As a matter of fact, there's a theory of the case. It's not one I necessarily subscribe to, that all of Putin's bombast with these doomsday weapons is actually trying to create leverage to get us and China to negotiate, and he wants to negotiate from a position of strength. The Chinese are going to be a much harder nut to crack, and I think the lesson from the first nuclear age is the Chinese are not going to be willing or eager to engage in serious negotiations until we have an arms race that they know they can't win, because we're not going to let them. They start understanding how scary this all is. And the argument, particularly if, as some suggest, China may be facing its own economic challenges in the coming decade, the argument of, wouldn't it be better to just stabilize this, achieve mutual deterrence, and save a little money, but more importantly, calm all this down, put some guardrails on it. I think that argument will hold sway eventually. Particularly, I think if we played our cards right, and again, we were the ones pushing for it, I think the Chinese would come under more and more international pressure to stand off of their just sort of right now, they're in the nope, just say no mode. But again, this has to be a long game. And that's the Cold War's experience. I mean, we started getting serious about arms control basically after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the first real breakthrough was the ABM and START 1. So that was a decade later, and that was a very modest breakthrough. We didn't get to the real significant treaties until the late 80s. So again, this isn't sort of, let's go over there and get this done in a year. We've got to create the conditions to make it happen. And that's a lot harder than, I mean, anyone can go to Geneva. It's a really pleasant place. I quite enjoyed my time in Geneva. Anyone can sit around the table. But until we create the conditions that we have the leverage and we have the domestic political consensus to see it through. One of the most remarkable things about the Cold War experience, especially from today's prism, so the SALT I process was started under the Johnson administration. Nixon Kissinger came in and basically picked up the baton really seamlessly with almost no changes. They got that done. They initiated the SALT II process. And then the Carter administration came in and almost seamlessly picked that up with no changes. The Reagan administration is thought to have come in and been very hawkish and kind of thrown it all out the window. That's actually not true. SALT II had kind of failed during the Carter tenure. Carter had initiated a strategic buildup to try to get leverage. Reagan accelerated that and maybe put a more of a hawkish spin on it. But essentially, there was more continuity between Carter and Reagan than discontinuity in my view. So again, for the United States, this needs to be a long-term prospect, and that means we need a bipartisan consensus on all of it, because if we don't, we will just keep every change in the White House or in the Senate is going to lead to us lurching between kind of a dovish disarmament or a hawkish rearmament, none of which is going to go anywhere. And all of that is just going to be seen as inconsistency, which will worry our allies and embolden our competitors.
Well said. I agree. From Roger Barnett, are there arms control solutions to catalytic attacks in a tripolar world?
I think one of my themes here is we need to be very modest in our hopes of what arms control can do in a realistic way. I don't see dramatic disarmament happening in the near future. I don't see a missile defense solution on the other side happening, particularly with the advent of hypersonics. I mean, to the contrary, missile defense becomes much harder. Really, I would say nearly impossible with today's architecture. So, you need to go space-based for hypersonics, at least in detection. All of which is to say, no, the best you can do, again, is try to take the edges off to try to stabilize deterrence relationships, to try to help part of arms control negotiations. This is going to sound kind of hokey. The journey is part of the destination. Part of the value, Joseph Nye wrote a great piece in the 1980s where he argued that part of the value of arms control isn't necessarily the controls in a treaty. It's the negotiating process, educating both sides about how they see deterrence, how their force posture works, how it fits in with their doctrine. Because you need to get into a deep understanding of all that when you're negotiating. In a multipolar situation, that becomes all the more important. Because this is not just, again, that standoff between the two gunfighters. This is this Mexican standoff, and getting an understanding. No one has any real idea of how the Chinese think about deterrence and how it might be different than how we and the Russians think about deterrence. And the Chinese, actually, one of the differences in how they think about deterrence, we and the Russians, we want you to know how we think about deterrence. We want you to know what we have. That's our whole model of deterrence. And we share that with the Russians. Be very clear. If you do this, we have that, and we will do so and so. The Chinese have a very different model of deterrence. This is a point that Randy Shriver, a former Assistant Secretary of Defense has made very eloquently, the Chinese version of deterrence is keeping ambiguous your intentions and your capabilities. An arms control process would help us work through that. So again, short answer is no. I don't think arms control is going to do anything to prevent that cataclysmic sort of thing if it happens, but it could make it somewhat less likely if it's done smartly and adroitly, which right now it's not being.
Yeah, thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left. From Deborah Lyle. She says, Russia can already shut down our power grid, infiltrate our sensitive internet access to businesses. San Francisco Russian embassy burned lots of documents prior to their exodus. Scary because possible too much secret data already known by the Russians. How do they address that, please?
So that's a great question and one I don't have an answer, but I don't feel bad because no one really has that answer yet. And there's a lot of work being done on that. I mean, we have our nuclear model of deterrence from the Cold War, which we know doesn't fit today, but we at least think it could be adapted. And then flowing from that, control measures. We don't know how to deter cyber. We don't know how to deter AI. We certainly don't know how to arms control it. So that's something where, a lot of people more expert than myself, and I dare say a lot smarter than myself, are expending a lot of energy trying to work through those issues. All I would say is, as I mentioned, shutting down the grid is really bad, but it's a walk in the park compared to general thermal nuclear war. So the fact that all these things intersect and destabilize nuclear deterrence relationships is at least something you can focus on. I may not know how to control cyber. I may not know how to deter cyber, but I can at least focus on the threat of cyber attacks on nuclear command and control, and perhaps start working on some codes of conduct, or if not codes of conduct, if not cooperative things, at least some declaratory policy where we would say we would consider a cyber attack on nuclear command and control to whatever it is, and be very clear, and we would respond such and such. So I realize this is probably not a very satisfying answer, and I apologize for that. But in part, you've asked a great question that doesn't really have a satisfying answer right now.
Thank you. So maybe the last question now is touch on how to weave in rogue states such as Iran and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea into the conversation.
So I think my answer is, again, to go back to kind of the Cold War situation and kind of do them as lesser included contingencies for our nuclear deterrence and force planning. But then also in the Cold War, the US and the Soviets agreed on non-proliferation. They agreed that their arms race should be a duopoly, and that they were better off arms racing against each other rather than having others get into the act. I think we need to replicate that dynamic. We have gotten into a dynamic now that says non-proliferation is something that the US wants. And China and Russia kind of view it as it's a US desire, because why? Who are we trying to non-proliferate against? We're trying to non-proliferate against people that they are friendlier with than we are, like Iran and North Korea. If non-proliferation starts being about Japan, starts being about Germany, starts being about South Korea, starts being about Australia, if the US basically says, you know what, maybe we're going to not try to prevent that. Heck, maybe we'll even encourage it. I think a consensus on non-proliferation could be developed pretty quickly. And the only reason that we have the Iran, the North Korea situation to the extent we do is because we don't have, we don't have the Russians, we don't have the Chinese all in. I mean, they're helpful, but they're not all in. I think in an uncontrolled great power nuclear arms race, you might get all the great powers all in to try to basically say, okay, well, let's keep this amongst ourselves.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Cooper. It was truly an honor and a privilege to host you this evening to speak about a very interesting and fascinating relevant topic. And we appreciate you taking time out of your busy academic schedule to spend it with us this evening.
Thanks very much, George. Appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for taking your time. And hopefully we'll do this again live at some point in the future.
There you go. And congratulations again on the book.
Great. Thanks so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes tonight's presentation. Our next lecture will be on Wednesday, December 15th by Dr. Stephen Knott, who will present remarks regarding intelligence operations in the American presidency. Updates to this presentation and others are posted on our own webpage at nwcfoundation.org/our-events. Thank you for tuning in tonight, and thank you all of you for your continued support for the missions of U.S. Naval War College and Naval War College Foundation. And an appeal, if you will, many nonprofits have suffered over the last 2 years due to COVID, and the Naval War College Foundation is no exception. As the end of our fiscal year approaches, we still have a lot of work to do to generate the resources required by the college and foundation to educate and inform today's decision makers and tomorrow's leaders to anticipate and prepare strategically for the future, strengthen the foundations of peace, and create a decisive warfighting advantage. Your support and very generous tax-deductible contributions are an investment in their learning and our national security, and we respectfully ask you to consider making an additional unrestricted gift to the Naval War College Foundation to support these admirable efforts. The Naval War College Foundation Board of Trustees and staff are working hard to expand our membership and raise awareness of the great institution which is the U.S. Naval War College. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. And if you're already a Naval War College Foundation member, please consider a gift of membership this holiday season to your friends and neighbors who may be interested or concerned as you are in issues affecting our national security. You can contact my staff directly for assistance or simply visit our website and select membership. Thank you again for your continued support and advocacy. Have a great rest of your evening and stay safe.